started. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm so excited to be hosting this webinar in partnership with the Arch National Respite Network. My name is Kim Whitmore, and I'm the current director of the Break Exchange. And I'll share a little bit more about the Break Exchange in just a minute, but I'm going to turn it over to Jill Kagan from Arch to just say a quick welcome from Arch.
Thank you, Kim. I'm Jill Kagan with the Arch National Respite Network and Resource Center, and we're really very excited to continue to participate in this international exchange of respite models. It's really illuminating and adds tremendously to our knowledge base about respite here in the U.S. So I want to thank our speakers for coming all the way from across the sea to be with us this morning, and thank you all to our Arch Network members for joining us as well.
Wonderful. So as we get started too, I just want to take a moment to again acknowledge the ongoing conflict in our partner country of Ukraine and recognize that that is impacting many of our other partners in the Break Exchange, especially our colleagues in Poland. And just wanted to take a moment to just acknowledge that here today as we are in this international space in the midst of an ongoing aftermath of all the conflict that has occurred in Ukraine. So I want to share a little bit about the Break Exchange. For those who aren't as familiar, we're going to go quick because most of you, I think, know about the Break Exchange. So BREAK stands for Building Respite Evidence and Knowledge, and we are an international group of researchers, respite providers, agencies, and individuals all committed to building a culture of evidence-based respite care. We have some incredible partners in this work. It was founded with a partnership between the International Short Break Association, the Arch National Respite Network and Resource Center, Shared Care Scotland, and I am housed at Marquette University in the College of Nursing, where I work as an assistant professor. We have many benefits of joining the Break Exchange. So if you are not already receiving our monthly newsletter and connecting to our networking hours, we encourage you to join, and we'll talk about ways you can do that. But we have many ways to connect, learn, share, and collaborate in this work. So connect with the Break Exchange means you are networked with a global group of, again, researchers, respite providers, agencies, and other individuals. We have really fun monthly networking hours that happen on the second Monday of every month. Great place just to informally meet and learn about what's happening with partners across the globe. We currently have more than 292 members from 18 countries and growing. We're really excited to see the growth of the Break Exchange over this past year. We love to share information and give opportunities to learn about evidence-based respite practice and research that is happening around the world. And we want you to share what you're working on too. So if you are working on a research project or you have an evidence-based practice project that you're involved in, please let us know so we can help highlight that in our monthly newsletter or post it on our website or social media platforms, or you can even present a quarterly webinar like we are doing today. We really hope that the Break Exchange creates opportunities for collaboration. So we want you to connect with one another so that we can find people who might be in need of a project partner. If you're a respite program and you have an idea for an evaluation project, but you have no idea what to do, come to the Break Exchange and we can help find you someone who might be willing to partner with the evaluation or the research aspect of that, and vice versa. We hope that you create your member profile, which is something you can do online, which allows people to search for you and find people with common interests. So we do have a searchable member database of members who have completed that member profile. So we encourage you to stay connected. Lots of ways to do that through social media, through our website, and you can always email us at info@breakexchange.org at any time. So I am going to go ahead and stop my share so that I can introduce today's webinar speaker. So we're so excited that we are actually hearing part 2 of the Shared Lives Day Support Services webinar. So we have Jill Toms, who is a Research and Practice Development Officer with the School of Medicine and Health Sciences at Bangor University in Wales. So we're so delighted to have her back. And she's going to share all about what they've been working on. And again, we have the first webinar. We'll post the link to that in the chat for those who want to see part 1 of this webinar. But I'm going to turn it over to Jill, who's going to share a little bit more about what they've been working on since we heard from them last, and let her share her screen and introduce herself a little bit more. And feel free as we go along to post questions in the chat, and we will have time at the end for some Q&A as well. So I will turn it over to you, Jill. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Kim. Just before I go on screen share, I just want to introduce two other people who are here today. I'm presenting today, but Louise Prendergast, who you'll see on camera and will give a wave, thank you, Louise, is the research officer on this project. And Louise is very much here to help me answer questions and respond to comments, especially about the social return on investment evaluation, because Louise is far more knowledgeable about this than I am. And also, just putting her on the spot slightly, could I ask Catherine Morgan to give a brief wave to camera, because Catherine Morgan is one of our research partners on the project. So let me now stop embarrassing people and I'll start screen sharing. There we go. So as Kim said, we previously presented our interim findings to the International Break Exchange Network. So thank you so much for having us back again and giving us this opportunity to share our end of project findings. I just want to start with a few acknowledgements. The study I'm talking about today is funded by Welsh Government through Health and Care Research Wales. And it involves researchers from Bangor University who are based in the Developing Evidence Enriched Practice Programme, the Centre for Ageing and Dementia Research, and the Centre for Health Economics and Medicine's Evaluation. I just introduced Catherine to you. Catherine is our partner at Shared Lives Plus, and we have another project partner organisation who are PSS UK Limited. So the study I'm talking about today has explored an exemplar community-based short break service. And in the presentation, I'm going to describe the short break service, provide an overview of the study, and we'll present the service logic model. We talked about the logic model in detail in our first webinar, but I'll do a bit of a recap because the logic model forms the basis of the SROI, the social return on investment evaluation. My focus today, though, is going to be on explaining how we undertook the SROI evaluation and share our pilot findings. And I hope to conclude with some recommendations. And we look forward to hearing your questions, comments, and observations at the end. So what is a short break? I don't think this will be new information to anyone here today, but I just wanted to share the definition of a short break we've used, which we've taken from Shared Care Scotland. And I'll pause for a minute so you can read the definition for yourselves. And as you read it, you'll see that a short break can encompass many different things, including small everyday activities, such as gardening in the picture, and day support. So I'll pause for a second for you to read the definition for yourself. So before talking about our exemplar short break, just about the need to explore short breaks more. Again, given the audience here, I'm not going to labour the point about unpaid carers and people with care and support needs accessing short breaks. I'm sure everyone here knows this already, but I will briefly just explain why we need to explore community-based short breaks. Traditional forms of short break, like stays in a residential home and day centre services, do not always meet people's wellbeing needs. People living with dementia in particular sometimes do report negative outcomes from day services and residential respite care. And in addition, people do not always want these types of traditional short break. Men may be particularly disinclined to attend day centres as the activities provided often do not match their interests or competencies. So we do need to explore short breaks that might meet the needs of people who do not want to access day centres or residential services. But please note, we're not saying that day centres and residential stays are not important. They are for many people, it's just that they don't suit everyone. So let's describe TRIO, our exemplar short break. TRIO is the day support service for people living with mild to moderate dementia, and the service calls these individuals citizens, and I'm going to use that name citizens throughout the presentation from now on. The service also supports their unpaid carers. In TRIO, a small group of citizens who have similar interests are matched with a paid companion who enjoys the same activities. This small group meets on a weekly basis in the home of the paid companion, and they access the local community for trips and activities. What makes TRIO innovative is that people are matched based on their interests as well as their needs. This means that people receive social support and can make new friends. Support is provided within a local community. People remain part of their community, and support is provided outside of an institutional environment. In each session, a companion supports only 2 or 3 individuals, so more personal support can be provided. And the same companion provides support each week, so relationships are established and maintained. There are similar schemes in several parts of the UK now, but our exemplar service operated in North Wales. So the study has explored TRIO using a social return on investment evaluation, and it's had 3 phases. In phase 1 and phase 2, a rapid evidence review and an interview study created a logic model for TRIO, and this formed the foundation for the social return on investment evaluation. So just quickly, in case anyone is unfamiliar with logic models, they are a visual accessible summary of how a short break has created change and what change is created. They can show and help explain relationships between the inputs, activities, and outcomes. And they're often used for planning, evaluation, and information sharing. Just to get a quick idea of people's familiarity with logic models, Kim, would you be able to launch the short poll for me? So have you created a logic model as part of a project or piece of service development work? Let's just wait for the poll to settle down. Excellent. So a small minority haven't, but a sizable minority have. Excellent. Thank you for that. So for those less familiar with logic models, hopefully you'll get a sense of them as I talk through our logic model for TRIO. And I've split our logic model over 2 slides. On this slide are the mechanisms and some of the contextual factors or features. These are the things that contributed towards positive outcomes in TRIO or influenced how TRIO was working at the time of the study. And these findings are based on our evidence review and our interviews with people involved in TRIO. I'd like to direct your attention first to the outputs column. And I'm sure to many people here, these outputs of how TRIO works to create positive outcomes won't look like anything new. They'll seem very familiar. They detail what is widely known to result in good support. However, in the preceding activities column, I'd just draw your attention to the matching process, because the matching process really did influence the quality of the outputs that happened. The theme running behind the outputs in the logic model is that these outputs involved the citizen, the unpaid carer, and the paid companion. So there was very much a triadic caring relationship that developed in TRIO. Everyone had a role, part to play in this relationship, and as we'll see, all people benefited from it. Creating and supporting triadic caring relationships is somewhat different from the focus in other forms of short break that focus primarily on dyadic caring relationships. The next slide hopefully illustrates a bit more about what I mean about these outputs being triadic. And I'll talk through an example which relates to the output you'll see on the slide near the top of choice and control. So in TRIO, citizens could choose what they wanted to do during their time with TRIO. Unpaid carers also felt they had a measure of control because the companion was consulting them about activities and they were negotiating safe activity choices amongst themselves. And then companions also felt they had a measure of control. They had some autonomy in how they were supporting citizens and building that relationship on a weekly basis. So this slide is presenting the second half of our logic model and presents the service outcomes. As I mentioned a second ago, citizens, unpaid carers and companions all experience positive outcomes from TRIO. The short and medium term outcomes listed in the first two columns are drawn on the evidence review data and our interview data, but the long-term outcomes are drawn primarily from the wider literature. Long-term outcomes weren't really the focus in our interview because on the whole, we were interviewing people currently engaged in TRIO, not people who could look back on what had happened over a longer period of time. Step one of the analysis for the SROI was to quantify the key outcomes reported for each stakeholder group. And we focused on the short and medium term outcomes as we could base these outcomes, or we had evidence for these outcomes from the literature and from our interviews. So let's turn to the SROI evaluation. And I'm sure many people by now might be wondering what an SROI evaluation is. And just before I answer that question, Kim, could you either launch the next poll or whatever format you've decided to launch in? Brilliant. So we do have it as a poll. So would you be able to answer the question for me? How much do you know about SROI? Again, I'm just waiting for the poll to settle down. Okay, so on the whole, some people know a little about SROI, and quite a few people have heard about it, which is excellent. And then we have a few people for whom SROI is a new thing. Hopefully, as I talk through, I'll just talk through about in brief now what an SROI is, but as I talk through what we've done, hopefully this will start to make more sense. So SROI is a form of economic analysis that examines the social value of an intervention. Basically, it's exploring whether the intervention creates more value than it costs. And if you think about costs just in terms of traditional money savings, like taking less nights in a residential care home bed, for instance, you might overlook less tangible financial savings, like experiencing better quality of life. And SROI is a method that tries to capture, in particular, these less tangible financial savings. So the basic principle in SROI is that you're calculating for each pound invested in an intervention, how much social value is generated. And it's based on approaches in health economics that aim to explore how the costs and benefits of interventions are balanced. There are normally 6 stages in conducting an SROI evaluation. The first 2 stages, identifying stakeholders and mapping outcomes, we did in phase 1 and 2 of the project, and I've just shared the logic model that says about our stakeholders and the outcomes we've mapped. So I won't discuss these stages of the project further today. We did discuss these phases in our first webinar that is available for you. So today, instead, I'm talking about the final 4 stages that we undertook in phase 3 of the study. And we'll talk through these now, starting with evidencing or quantifying the outcomes. In terms of evidencing our outcomes, TRIO was an existing service and citizens didn't really come in and exit the service on a frequent basis. The turnover in the service was low, so it wasn't feasible for us to plan a pre-post analysis. Instead, we needed to explore TRIO outcomes retrospectively. Because of that, we designed questionnaires to capture to what extent the key outcomes identified for each stakeholder group had been experienced. These questions drew on some existing measures, such as the flourishing scale, but on the whole, we adapted wording from existing questionnaires and added our own questions because we wanted to capture the precise outcomes that people were telling us were important in TRIO. On this slide, you'll see an example question from our questionnaire for unpaid carers. On our citizen questionnaire, instead of asking before, and after questions, we just asked citizens about the outcomes they had experienced since attending TRIO. We recognise that asking citizens to answer questions retrospectively could have been difficult. Also, just to repeat, this was a service for people with mild to moderate symptoms of dementia. So for many of the citizens, if we had been asking them about before TRIO, this would have been before the onset of their dementia, and this could have confounded their responses. Once we had quantified the outcomes people were experiencing, we assigned them a value. And to assign values to our outcomes, we quantified the outcome that was leading to better well-being, found another outcome with a known financial value that had a similar effect on well-being, and used this proxy outcome to calculate how financially valuable our outcome was. So that this doesn't seem like a dark art, I'll talk through an example. So unpaid carers experiencing peace of mind can contribute to well-being in a similar way, arguably, to someone regularly practicing yoga or another form of meditation. Looking at local charges in North Wales, if someone was to access 4 hours of led meditation on a weekly basis for 50 weeks of the year, this would cost £1,000. TRIO provides unpaid carers with a 6-hour break, but we reasoned that peace of mind would probably fluctuate during that 6 hours. So costing for a 4 hours of peace of mind seemed reasonable. So if unpaid carers on the questionnaire said they had 100% more peace of mind after engaging with TRIO than before engaging with TRIO, we initially applied a social value of £1,000 to this outcome. There is a list of, or a results of financial value values that have been built up by researchers over time. And we use this hacked social value bank whenever possible, as this is considered the most reliable source of financial values. But in some cases, like the example I've just shared, we use market rates because there was no suitable financial value that already existed. So over the next few slides, I've detailed the outcomes we sought to capture on each questionnaire, given a flavour about the questionnaire items we used that captured the different dimensions of that outcome. And I've given you the financial proxy we used on each occasion. So starting with citizens, you can see that we quantified 4 outcomes, and on each case we were using multiple questions to cover the various dimensions of each outcome. There's always an element of subjectivity when you choose financial proxies. Different research teams might choose different financial proxies. The aim in an SROI evaluation is to be transparent and to provide a justification and your rationale for the selection. So do shout out as I go through if you want me to explain the rationale for any of these choices, and me and Louise will hope to try and answer your question. And also at the end, of course, feel free to ask questions about the proxies we've selected. I'll just pause for a minute so you can have a glance through the slide before I go on. So for unpaid carers, we finally quantified 2 outcomes, and you'll see in both cases, again, we use multiple questions to encompass the range of dimensions in the outcome. And hopefully the choice of our financial values seem logical when you scan through. You'll also see in the final row in red that we had originally planned to quantify and value a 3rd outcome for unpaid carers. And I'll come back to why this outcome wasn't included in the final analysis in a minute. But before I do that, we also quantified 2 outcomes for companions. And just to clarify, this is the social value they experienced in addition to the pay they received. It can be less usual in SROI evaluations to include outcomes for paid workers. But companions and other shared lives carers have quite a different role to other care workers. Citizens and unpaid carers really can become virtually part of the companion's family. So it seemed important to us to explore the 9 financial benefits of this form of work for companions. So as you'll see, we looked at job satisfaction and feelings of greater social connection for our companions. So the decision about what counts as more of an outcome needs to be clearly specified in SROI evaluations. There are different ways to do this, and the basic principle is illustrated on the slide. So if the after rating is a step higher or more than the before rating, regardless of where it is on the scale, you can judge that an outcome has increased. Because we were using multiple questions to cover each of our outcomes, we summed the ratings given for each outcome. And when this overall outcome total had increased by 10% or more, we judged that a meaningful outcome had occurred for the respondent and that their data could be added into the evaluation. The further the distance travelled, the more of the proxy financial value was added into the analysis. For citizens, we said, you'll remember we were just asking citizens about their experience since TRIO, so we didn't have before and after ratings. And we said that for citizens, a meaningful outcome was present if they rated an outcome as 70% or greater of the total. And again, the greater the rating for the outcome after 70%, the more of that total financial proxy value was added into the analysis. So let me just come back to the outcome we didn't in the end include for unpaid carers. We had wanted to value positive caring relationships for unpaid carers. This was an outcome that came out in our interview data. However, in the questionnaire ratings, there wasn't a 10% difference between people's pre and post ratings, so we couldn't enter this outcome to be valued in the analysis. And just to note, this was because people's pre-ratings for having positive caring relationships were already high. So our scale didn't have scope to really show further improvement on that outcome. One other thing to mention is the pitfall in SROI of overcounting the value. We had originally thought about including a broad outcome of better citizen well-being based on our interview findings. However, of course, citizens experience increased confidence and being less isolated or more socially connected are both facets of people having better well-being. It would have been overcounting or double counting, if you prefer, to include both of these facets of well-being plus an overall well-being outcome. As when selecting financial proxy values to use, deciding what can and cannot be included in the SRI calculation can be open to subjective interpretation. And again, the aim is to be open to scrutiny and provide a rationale for each of the decisions made. On the questionnaires, we asked 3 further questions, and I've listed the questions we asked on this slide. And these questions were to discover how each outcome related to TRIO. So the first question you can see is about attribution. How much of the outcome the respondent thought was due to TRIO? The second question is about dead weight. How much of the outcome the respondent thought they would experience anyway? And the third question is about displacement. Activities the respondent had stopped due to engaging with TRIO that had been contributing to the outcome. Based on these responses, we adjusted the value of the outcome because these questions were designed to ensure that we are attributing the right amount of outcome to TRIO. Just to return to our example about underpaid carers experiencing peace of mind, obviously there may have been many other things contributing to unpaid carers having peace of mind. It would have been overclaiming to attribute all their improvements in their peace of mind to TRIO. So I just want to have a pause at this point, because I realise the SROI method can seem complicated. So this is an opportunity for me just to try and summarise the basic principle of what's going on. The cake, which looks a rather nice cake to me on this slide, represents an outcome. And when the whole cake is present, 100% of the outcome is present. But obviously no intervention delivers 100% of the outcome 100% of the time. So you need to cut away slices of the cake until the amount of cake matches the amount of outcome you can confidently attribute to the intervention. So first, we've removed slices so that the cake matched the size of the outcome reported. We then took out more slices to discount the amount of outcome not attributed to TRIO, the amount of outcome attributed to other things, and the amount of outcome people missed out on. So you'll appreciate the figure we're eventually adding into our analysis has been substantially reduced from our starting value. And hopefully this will enhance confidence that we're not overclaiming the benefits we report. In many interventions, you would look at outcomes over a longer time period. We're just looking at a 1-year time period, but other studies will often report over a 2 or 3 year time horizon. And if you're reporting over a longer horizon, you'd also reduce the outcomes after the first year, because we know that outcomes reduce over time. And you'd apply a further reduction based on what would happen when someone stops engaging in the intervention. We didn't do these additional steps in this study, and we only looked at a 1-year reporting horizon because there's no set endpoint in TRIO. TRIO continues to work with citizens and their unpaid carers until the individual is no longer benefiting from the service. And many people involved in this study had been involved with TRIO for 6 years, up to 6 years, and in some cases longer. Short breaks are also not a form of intervention that you do for a while and then stop and expect the benefit just to continue into the future. So that was another reason why it was less applicable in this analysis to look at those extra steps. But the implication for not doing those steps means that what we are saying when we report the value in a few minutes is that this is the value that's present while someone is engaging with TRIO. We do not expect this value to last if someone stops engaging with TRIO. How you normally report your SRI is in an SRI ratio, and the calculation of the ratio is the straightforward bit, but it's only meaningful if the previous steps have been undertaken with rigor, and it's only meaningful if you have the surrounding evidence and data that say why that ratio is significant, what value that ratio represents. Any ratio has a degree of imprecision, so often you conduct a range of sensitivity analysis to explore what happens if various inputs and outcomes change. As this was a pilot, I'm just going to focus today on one sensitivity analysis. So we conducted our pilot and collected our data when the COVID-19 pandemic in the UK was still affecting people's daily lives. TRIO had continued to offer a service, but face-to-face meetings had reduced and group activities were only just restarting when we were doing the questionnaires. If TRIO had been operating its normal model where there was a lot of social activities, lots of group activities, lots of face-to-face contact, the outcomes captured in the questionnaires might have been better. Our interview data, our service data collected by the service that was anonymized and shared with us, and wider literature during this time all suggested this was a reasonable assumption to make and therefore a reasonable sensitivity analysis to take a look at. So again, I just want to pause for a second before I come on to the results in case anyone has a question about the method. I can't, because I'm on screen share, I can't see everyone on this screen, so you might need to come off mute if anyone wants to ask a question at this point, and I can come off screen share.
Thanks, Jill. This is Kim. I can monitor the chat for you if people have questions in the chat, or you can feel free to unmute if you have a question.
Okay. Shall I come out screen share and we can do some questions now, or would you like me to continue, Kim, until the end?
Totally up to you. Totally up to you.
Let me just, I'll stop screen sharing for just a second and just open the chat just to see if the cake does look delicious. Right. Okay, as there's no questions at the moment, I'll continue to the end, but I'm very happy at the end to come back to any points about the method that people would like me to clarify. So let's turn to what we found, and let's start with who actually participated in the study. And the first thing I need to do is give a caveat, because you'll see in the top row of this table, we had a very small sample size for our questionnaire. So you can see 7 citizens, 3 unpaid carers, and 4 companions participated. Our small sample size means we cannot have full confidence in the ratio I'm going to show on the next slide, because when you're generating a ratio, if the numbers you're using are very small, there's obviously a large margin for error. So our analysis really should be considered a pilot, an indication of what could potentially be found in a larger study. And what I'd encourage people to do is take away the gist of our findings, but not necessarily the numerical values I'm going to show in the ratio. I also want to, for full transparency, draw your attention particularly to the small number of unpaid carers who participated. And again, for full transparency, the questionnaires returned by unpaid carers had some missing data. So we had to impute some data based on mean responses, the mean responses we had. And we did that using assumptions based on our stronger interview data for unpaid carers. So we knew from the interviews what types of outcomes people were strongly endorsing. But this obviously means we need to be even more cautious when we're drawing conclusions about unpaid carers from this small amount of data. On the other side of the coin, what matters most in the SROI is that the sample is representative of the population of interest. Our sample of companions was small, as you can see, it was 4, but TRIO at the time of our study only had 7 companions, so we did have returns from nearly half of our population. So in terms of companion data, maybe we can say we are relatively strong compared to our data for other participants. And just so you can see, as I said, some people had been involved, citizens and unpaid carers, with TRIO for a considerable length of time. And you'll also see that our sample is fairly homogeneous in that it reflects the area the study took place in, and it probably also reflects the statistics about who's most likely to provide paid and unpaid care as well. But this is a point I'll return later when we consider future recommendations and study limitations. So I'll talk through this slide in more detail in a moment, but first just let me recap on what the SRI ratio shows, because I've tried to cram quite a lot into this presentation, so it's probably helpful to recap. But the SRI ratio indicates how much social value is created from each pound invested. If the amount generated is £1 or less, then there's no additional value. Any social value exceeding £1 once costs are removed would indicate an additional value. And we've got this ratio from dividing the outcomes, the value of the outcomes, by the costs of providing TRIO. TRIO is a relatively low-cost service. In the year 21 to 22, when we conducted this part of the study, it was costing £6,169 per citizen per year to provide. Now, turning to the actual details that are on the slide, the only takeaway figure, though, as I said, I'd be cautious in taking away an actual figure from this presentation, but if you were, the figure to take away is the figure in bold under the additional value generated column, so the total. value. And this shows that for £1 invested in Trio, £2.82 is being generated. The figures that aren't bolded in the rows preceding this total value just shows how that total value is attributed to the different stakeholders, but these individual attributions can't be interpreted individually. The only number you can actually interpret as a ratio on this slide is the £2.82 total. But if we look at how the value is attributed to the different stakeholders, it does make sense that most social value is attributed to citizens. Citizens are the main recipients of the service. Most of this value seems to come from citizens gaining a greater sense of control over their activities, feeling more confident, and achieving a greater sense of social connection with others. And paid carers did report gaining peace of mind, and of the outcomes we were able to value, this was the largest reported benefit for them. But again, due to the weak data and the problems we had valuing some of our unpaid care outcomes, we don't think this is probably a fair representation of the value created. And then if we look at the value attributed to paid companions, contrary to our hypothesis, paid companions did not seem to gain value additional or much value additional to their pay, but the highest value they endorsed was from feeling more connected. And perhaps this does warrant some further exploration, given the problems we know that exist in social care services in terms of staff retention. The final column on this slide is our sensitivity analysis, where to compensate for doing the study under COVID times, we put a 30% uplift in our outcomes. And again, contrary to our hypothesis, applying this 30% uplift didn't really alter the social value figure, and there was a marginal difference. Again, this is primarily due to people reporting good outcomes on the questionnaires anyway, so there wasn't much room to see further improvement. What we do know from our interviews, though, is even if the quantity of people's outcomes didn't seem to differ during the COVID period and when the service had to change how it worked a little, there does seem evidence in the interviews that the quality of how people experienced those outcomes had changed during that period. And we would expect people to experience greater value and significance from their outcomes as the service returns to its more normal way of operating. So before turning to recommendations, I just want to summarise some of the study's strengths and weaknesses, though hopefully I've drawn out some of the weaknesses as I've gone through. But in terms of study strengths, for companions and unpaid carers, we had rich interview data on which to base our logic model, and therefore to understand why the social value generated in Trio is significant, what significance it has for people. We've endeavoured to be transparent in how we've undertaken the SROI, and we were able to draw on some external scrutiny of our method. An external experienced health economist, part of the team, but not part of the study, did have some input into the analysis and cast an experienced eye over it. However, just to recap on some of our limitations. As I said, we had difficulty valuing our unpaid carer outcome of positive caring relationships because there was no change in that outcome. But actually, the questionnaire data and our interview data all suggested that what was happening in Trio is that a positive caring relationship was being maintained. And actually, in the context of progressive conditions such as dementia, maintaining positive outcomes is a valuable outcome in its own right. But at the moment, it's difficult in the SROI method to include the value of a maintained outcome and reflect that in the social value figure. I talked earlier on that we couldn't provide a baseline for Trio. We couldn't do a pre-post analysis, So we had to ask people to say retrospectively what things were like before TRIO. This is acceptable and feasible in an SROI, and we've demonstrated that it can work in short break research. However, having a baseline or baseline data would increase confidence in the findings, and whenever possible, we would recommend that people collect baseline data for this type of analysis. As I said earlier, in terms of the subjectivity around SRI, there is subjectivity in the proxy values which are selected, but there can also be some subjectivity in the outcomes you decide to value. When I talked through the logic model, I indicated that we chose to focus on our short and medium term outcomes because we had both interview data and evidence from the rapid evidence review to support those outcomes. But another team might have focused more on the long-term outcomes, and they would therefore have chosen different financial proxies and might have come out with a different financial value figure at the end. I won't labour the point about our small sample size anymore, but I will just return to the point I made when I shared our sample characteristics about the transferability of our logic model, because the logic model has, as you saw, been based on a fairly homogeneous sample. We don't know whether the logic model will be as true for men or for people from different ethnicities, and that needs further research. Though I would say that Shared Lives services in general and TRIO in particular are very person-centered. So on that basis, I would expect some transferability in some of those outcomes and maybe some of those mechanisms of action. So when we finished our data collection period, we held a knowledge exchange event. And the aim of this event was to sense check the findings and to co-produce recommendations for policy and practice and explore ideas for future research. Attendees at this event did believe that the findings we shared with them reflected their experience of TRIO. People at that event did think that TRIO, from their experience, was a service that created significant and meaningful outcomes for people. And most people were keen to see more services like TRIO available. The following recommendations are based in part on feedback from this event. So there was an appetite for policies that would help promote regular short breaks as part of a normal routine for unpaid carers. There was an appetite for the commissioning of more community-based short break services. In terms of a practice recommendation, we've highlighted the need to explore more models of short break options that can support relational care. You'll recall that I talked about how our logic model, behind our logic model was the idea of a triadic caring relationship in our outputs. Triadic caring relationships will not be appropriate in all short break options, but actually relational care that can sit behind triadic caring relationships and more dyadic caring relationships will be appropriate in most short break models. It's also worth commenting on the suggestion for future research. This future research agenda came particularly strongly from people in the knowledge exchange events, especially those who were involved in commissioning and local policy development. What they really wanted to see was research that compared the outcomes of different types of short break to help inform their decision making. Social return on investment is probably not the best method to do this. SRI is not a comparative method, but obviously SRI method is a method that you can use to gain a detailed understanding of different types of short break and the value they create. But there's clearly a space in short breaks research for more traditional comparative research that will help over time determine what forms of short break work best, when and for whom. So you'll see at the end that you'll have access to the references I've cited, and just to draw your attention to the HACT, which is the Bank of Social Financial Proxy Values, if people are interested in this, and just to acknowledge where the images I've used have come from. It's only left for me to say, as I'm in Wales, Diolch yn fawr am wrando. Thank you very much for listening. And I'll come off screen share, and me and Louise are happy to try and answer your questions. If you'd rather not ask in this forum, please do feel free to send me or Louise or Diane, who unfortunately can't be here because she was on leave today, but feel free to drop one of us an email if you'd prefer to get in touch that way. So let me come off screen share.
Okay, thank you so much, Jill. We really appreciate that great presentation. We have a few minutes left for questions. So again, feel free to post them in the chat, or if you're comfortable, unmute, put your camera on and say hi to us, and feel free to ask your question that way. So give it a minute if people have questions. Otherwise, I have some for you. So we have a question from Cheryl. How was the data gathered? Was this a duty of companions?
Thank you, Cheryl. Sure, thank you, Cheryl. It wasn't a duty of companions, though in the end, companions did support us with the data collection because of the COVID restrictions that were in place. We could offer participants help on the phone or via an online platform such as Zoom, but many citizens were more comfortable having that face-to-face support while they completed the questionnaire, so it was companions who assisted in those cases. But citizens and unpaid carers and companions could also complete their questionnaires entirely independently. They completed the questionnaires either in hard copy or through an online form. So many people also just completed the questionnaires independently and returned them to us.
Great.
I have a somewhat of a comment, although if there's an answer to it, I'd be happy to hear it. In Wisconsin, we've got, I guess when I think on return on investment studies, when we think about how we prove that our programs are producing something that saves money, it tends to be just that. If we're going to try to get support from the legislature or something for more programming, funding, it has to be like you're saving money somewhere else, so it's worth the investment over here. But some of the things with these programs are very not money-like. I mean, when you talk about, you know, how more they're socially connected, they have a better quality of life. Those things don't necessarily have a dollar value on them that some people in policy making can identify with. I mean, it means a lot to us because we work in that, but to them, when they're talking strictly dollars, it doesn't always translate that way. And I'm just curious, what you would say is a way to, how do you address that in a way that's really proven to be beneficial?
I think that is a tricky one, and I think this is where social return on investment may have a place, because social return on investment analysis is aiming to value some of those less tangible outcomes in quite a rigorous and transparent way that you can fully evidence. SROI is being used more and more in different areas, so it's potentially over time, maybe policymakers and funders will accept that evidence more. Louise, is there anything you'd like to add on that point?
Yeah, so definitely social return on investment is a relatively new cost benefit analysis, but some of the benefits of an SROI is that it involves many stakeholders. So you're not just looking at the people who are the managers, you're looking at the people who it affects, an organisation or an intervention who it affects. So that's always good to take back to the stakeholders, to be able to say, as Jill said, you've got this transparency of process, but you're involving stakeholders throughout the process. And as Jill said as well, you're accounting for values that are less tangible, but you're quantifying them. So first of all, you're qualifying them, you're going to the stakeholders, you're finding out what is important to them, what are the outcomes, what are the benefits to them. And sometimes these stakeholders are excluded from other economic analyses. So in that term, it's positive to take back. There are quite a few resources in the UK that you could always sort of take and say, well, this is used here and it's valued for this purpose, but because it accounts for the broader concept of value, and that's one of the selling points.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Catherine. You're muted, Catherine.
Sorry, you're still on mute.
Sorry about that. Just to add to what Louise and Jill were saying there about SROI, in Wales, we have the Social Services and Wellbeing Wales Act, and the key principles of that are about voice, choice and control. It's focusing in on people's well-being. So we do have service providers who are accountable and responsible for adhering to that particular act. So this fits extremely well, this piece of research, with the act, and that's how we intend to spread the word and the news that actually, you know, there are really positive outcomes from the TRIO service.
Thank you, Catherine. I've seen the question in the chat. Louise, can I refer that directly to you, because that's a slightly more technical question.
Sorry, I didn't see
SRI.
this.
So can we use the idea of SRIs quantifying social determinants of health outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, because what you're going to be looking at, yeah, you can use an SROI for social determinants of health outcomes. You've got various, if you go look at the financial proxies, you can, you've got like something like called a SWEMWebs or a WEMWebs, which are questionnaires that focus specifically on asking questions about well-being. And then these would be sort of like before or after intervention or midpoint after intervention. Social determinants, do you want to expand on that? Who? The social determinants, quantifying social determinants of the health outcomes.
So that was a question from Barb.
Barb, are you able to add a bit more?
So this is Barb, and
Hi, Barb.
my question was a way for us here in the United States, where we do not have that wonderful act as in Wales, where we could present an SROI as a method of quantifying. Our government is all about social determinants of health. So if you can show outcomes based on that, and you can also show a quantification in terms of dollar figures that boosts your use of the SROI. Anyway, that's what I was thinking.
I see. I think you'd go back to your logic model for that, because your logic model would have, and Jill, I don't know if you agree with this, but because you've got your logic model, which is your inputs, what goes in, and you've got your activities, what occurs from these, outputs, what happens from these, and the outcomes to different people. But you've also got your context and assumption. So it's a context of what is happening in the wider environment as well. And a logic model has your sort of, it's your story of change, it's your story of an organization, and it's got all those different components. So social determinants would be fitting somewhere there as an impact on some of the mechanisms of your interventional organization.
Yes, I'd agree with that. I think you would need that logic model to explain why those social determinants of led to the proposed health outcomes, essentially. And then I think you'd be on a fairly firm basis using SRI in that way.
Okay. Well, we are, believe it or not, at our time for today. So if there are more questions, I encourage you to please reach out. You can also engage on the Break Exchange social media, connect through the member exchange as well, and really hope that we can hear more about this work. I think there's a lot of potential for the social return on investment to help us generate some more of the evidence about the value of respite care, which has been really difficult to quantify. And as Lynn Gall mentioned, something a lot of policymakers really want to know is show me the money. And we can't show them the money without a method like the social return on investments. I think it has some really incredible applications. So I want to thank Jill and her team for doing this work and for sharing the results. We can't wait to share out more as things continue. I did post a reminder in the chat about registering for the National Lifespan Respite Conference if you haven't already, and please join the break exchange, and hopefully we'll see you at our next networking event in September with our host from Poland. So we encourage you to stay connected to the break exchange. We thank everyone for their time today, and especially thank you to our speakers. And hopefully we'll see you at our next webinar. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks.